"Your penthouse is for your sister's wedding," my mom said, her voice a low hiss that cut through the party chatter. And then came the slap. The sound of it, a sharp crack that seemed to silence the whole world, was followed by the sting blooming across my cheek. Right there, in the middle of my own living room, with the glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline as our backdrop, my world tilted on its axis. My name is Chloe Sinclair, and until that exact moment, I thought I had it all figured out. I was the woman who had clawed her way up from nothing to become one of the most sought-after interior designers in New York. This penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and sweeping views of Central Park, wasn't just an apartment. It was a testament to every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every ounce of creativity I'd poured into my life. It was my sanctuary, my fortress, and they saw it as nothing more than a venue, a prop for their own social climbing. Looking at my mother, Helen, her face twisted with a rage I'd never seen before, and my sister, Olivia, standing just behind her with a look of triumphant expectation, I finally understood. They weren't proud of me. They were proud of what I could provide. The perfect daughter, the perfect sister, was only perfect as long as she was useful. That slap wasn't about a party. It was about control. It was the price of admission to a family I was realizing I never truly belonged to. But they made a fatal mistake that night. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would cry and give in, just like I always. They didn't realize they had just one thing I'd been missing, a reason to finally fight back. This is the story of how I lost and found myself. It's messy and it's painful, but it's the thing you'll want to stick around to see how it ends. To make sure you get the whole story, you can follow along right here. That way, you won't miss what I did next. Before the slap, there was a phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I remember, because the light was hitting my living room just right, making the crystal vase on the coffee table throw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. I was sketching a design for a client in the Hamptons, feeling that perfect hum of creative energy. Then my phone buzzed with Olivia's picture on the screen, a smiling, sunny selfie from her last vacation. I answered, expecting to hear about her day, about some trivial drama at the marketing firm she worked at. Instead, her voice was fizzing. She told me Mark had proposed. My heart did this little leap of genuine happiness for her. Olivia, my baby sister, was getting married. She launched into the story. A surprise picnic in Brooklyn Bridge Park, a vintage ring, the whole 9 yards. And I was right there with her, picturing it all, feeling a surge of sisterly pride. She told me Mark was just the best, so ambitious, so charming. I'd only met him a few times. He was handsome, I guess, in that generic finance bro way. Expensive watch, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a handshake that felt more like a power move. But he made Olivia happy, and that's all that was supposed to matter. We talked for an hour, planning, dreaming. I immediately offered to help with the wedding costs, to connect her with the best planners I knew. That's always been my role. The provider, the fixer. It was a role I was happy to play. Or so I thought. The first crack in the facade appeared about a week later. It was a 3-way call with my mom, Helen. After the initial pleasantries, my mom dropped it in, her tone light and breezy like she was commenting on the weather. She said they'd had the most brilliant idea, an engagement party. Not just any party, but a truly elegant affair to introduce Mark to the wider family and, more importantly, to his business associates. She told me how crucial it was for his career that they make the right impression. And then, the pitch. She said, "Wouldn't it be just perfect to have it at my penthouse?" She painted a picture of champagne flutes clinking against the backdrop of the city lights, of Mark's boss being so impressed. Olivia chimed in, her voice dripping with honey, telling me how much it would mean to her. She said she'd always dreamed of having a party in my beautiful home. My stomach tightened. I love my home. It's my safe space, the one place on earth that is entirely mine, curated and protected. The thought of it swarming with strangers, with Mark's smarmy colleagues, felt like a violation. I politely declined. I explained that my home wasn't really set up for large events and that I treasured my privacy. But I immediately followed up with a generous offer. I told them to pick any 5-star hotel ballroom, any chic restaurant in the city, and I would foot the entire bill, the St. Regis, the Plaza, wherever they wanted. My treat. There was a silence on the other end of the line that sucked all the warmth out of the conversation. My mother was the first to speak. Her breezy tone was gone, replaced by a sharp, wounded edge. She told me she didn't understand why I had to be. She said it wasn't about the money, it was about the personal touch. It was about family. Olivia started to sniffle, telling me she felt like that I didn't want my world to mix with theirs. The guilt trip was... By the time I hung up, I felt awful, like I was the selfish, unloving one. But a part of me, a small, stubborn voice, knew I wasn't wrong. A boundary is a boundary. The real proof, the thing that turned a tiny crack into a chasm, 3 days later. I got a text from my Aunt Carol, who lives in Connecticut. It was a photo of a save-the-date card, beautifully designed with elegant calligraphy. It announced the engagement party for Olivia and Mark, and right there, at the bottom, printed in shimmering gold ink, was the address. My address. I stared at the phone, my blood turning to ice. They hadn't just ignored my no, they had pretended it never happened. They had gone behind my back and sent out invitations, trapping me, forcing my... They were counting on me being too embarrassed to turn away guests who showed up at... My breath caught in my chest. I read the text from my aunt. She'd written how thrilled she was that I was hosting, how generous I was. The words felt like acid. Generous. They were using my own reputation against me. It wasn't a request, it was an invasion. And that's when I realized the battle for my home, for my life, had already begun. They had fired the first shot without me even knowing I was at war. My first instinct was to call and to forward the text from Aunt Carol to Olivia and my mother with 1,000 question marks, but my hand hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. What would they do? They'd lie. They would tell me Aunt Carol was confused, that it was a draft, a mistake. They would twist it until I was the one who was crazy, overreacting. I had spent a lifetime being gaslit by my mother's expertise, and I knew confronting them without irrefutable proof was a losing game. So, I did nothing. I texted my aunt back something breezy, a simple, "Can't wait to celebrate with you." And then I shut my phone off. The silence in my apartment was deafening. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city lights, which usually comforted me, felt like a million accusing eyes. I was a designer. My job was to see the hidden structures beneath the surface, to understand how things connect. And for the first time, I was applying that skill to my own life. I needed to see the blueprint of their betrayal. Around 3 a.m., wrapped in a blanket but still feeling a bone-deep chill, I padded over to my desk and opened my laptop. There was an old family account we all shared for cloud storage, photo streams, that kind of thing. We had set it up years ago when I first moved to college. I rarely used it anymore, but I knew Olivia and my mom still did, treating it like a digital attic for everything from old vacation photos to scanned documents. My fingers felt like ice as I typed in the password. It felt like breaking into my own past. At first, it was just what I expected. Folders of Christmases and birthdays, blurry photos of me and Olivia with gap-toothed smiles. A wave of nostalgia hit me so hard, it almost made me stop. This was my family. I was being paranoid, crazy, just like they would say, but I pushed the feeling down. I wasn't that little girl anymore. I started looking at the more recent files, tucked away in a folder innocuously labeled Ollie's Big Day. I found it. It wasn't a document. It was a shared note, the kind you can collaborate on from different phones. The title was Project Prestige. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a running conversation between my mother, Olivia, and Mark. His name being on there sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This wasn't just my family. Her fiancé was in on it from the beginning. Their words scrolled across my screen, glowing in the dark room. It was all there. They weren't just planning an engagement party. They were mapping out a campaign. They discussed how hosting the event at my prestigious address was the perfect launch for Mark and his new firm. They had a list of guests, and next to each name was a note. My name was next to several. Chloe's contact, must invite. They were mining my life, my connections, people I had spent years building professional trust. They talked about the wedding itself, speculating on how much I would contribute. My mother had written a whole paragraph about how to frame the request for a down payment on a house as my wedding gift to them, calling it an investment in the family's future. My own mother was teaching my sister's fiancé how to manipulate me for money, but the part that made the air leave my lungs, the part that felt like a physical blow, was a comment from Olivia. Underneath a section about the party budget, my mother had noted that they should use my caterer and just add it to my house account. Olivia had replied, I can see her typing it on her phone, probably laughing. She'd written that I would never even notice, that I was too busy with my important career to sweat the details, and that it's the least she can do after being so selfish about the venue. Selfish. There it was. My hard work, my success, my independence. To them, just selfish. My generosity was an expectation, and my boundary convenience to their plan. They didn't just want they wanted my life. They wanted to wear my success like a costume. I leaned back in my chair, the laptop's glow illuminating the tears I didn't realize were streaming down my face. It wasn't the money. It was the chilling, calculated nature of it all. The complete and utter lack of love or respect. They saw me as a bank, a brand, a stepping stone. As I sat there in the dark, the shock slowly, terrifyingly, began to curdle into something else. It was the cold, hard clarity of knowing you are utterly alone. The last thread of hope that this was all a misunderstanding didn't just snap. It disintegrated, and in its place, resolute, I felt it burned away the tears and the shock. Terrifying. Project Prestige was ugly, but it felt survivable. It was about greed and social climate. Handle that. I could say no, draw the line, and deal with the fallout. What I couldn't shake was Mark's name on that list. His involvement felt different, more a successful, ambitious guy from a supposedly wealthy. Why would he be so invested in the guest list for an engagement party at his future sister-in-law's apartment? The question echoed in the silent, pristine rooms of my home. The pieces didn't fit. For the next 2 days, I was a ghost in my own life. I postponed client meetings, blaming a sudden migraine. I lived on black coffee and the adrenaline coursing through my system. The view of Central Park, usually a source of peace, was just a blur of green and gray. My mind was elsewhere, digging, searching for the missing piece. The key, I knew, had to be with my mother. She was the architect of our family's dynamics. Years ago, I had set up her online banking and bill payments. She was always hopeless with technology. I had saved the login details in a secure password manager, one we both had access to in case of emergencies. At the time, it felt like the responsible thing for a daughter to do. Now, it felt like a key left in a lock. My hands shook as I logged in, a wave of guilt washing over me. This was a line I had never imagined crossing, but they had burned the rule book. I was just trying to navigate the ashes. I started with her bank statements. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. A large expense? A sudden debt? It all looked normal for months back. Frustrated, I switched to her email, which was linked to the bank account. I used the search bar, typing in Mark's last name, Donahue, and there it was. Not an email from Mark, but a chain of them between my mother and a man named George Donahue, Mark's father. My blood ran cold. The subject line was, finalizing the family agreement. It sounded so corporate, so sterile. I clicked it open. The emails went back 6 months, long before the engagement was even announced. They weren't talking about a marriage. They were negotiating a merger. George Donahue laid out his family's situation in stark, unemotional terms. His real estate development company, Donahue Properties, was on the verge of collapse. They were over-leveraged, drowning in debt after a few bad investments. He mentioned optics and the need to project stability and growth to avoid a complete implosion. Then he got to my part. He referred to me not by name, but as the Sinclair asset. He wrote about my significant liquid capital and my high-value property portfolio. He detailed a plan where, after the wedding, Mark would leverage the new family connection to convince me to invest in a new, promising Donahue Properties venture. It was a shell company, a black hole designed to swallow my money and use it to pay off their secret debts. My mother's replies were what truly broke me. She was an active participant. She advised George Donahue on the best way to approach. She told him I was fiercely independent, but had a debilitating soft spot for Olivia. She suggested they use my sister's happiness as the ultimate leverage. The plan was to isolate me from my friends and business advisors, to make me feel that my only real family was them, and that their financial security was my responsibility. The house down payment they wanted wasn't for a home. It was the seed money. The test to see how easily I would open my checkbook. I felt a profound physical nausea. This wasn't just about a party or a wedding gift. This was a long con. They had been grooming me, positioning me for months. My sister's love story wasn't a romance. It was a business transaction, and I was the commodity being sold. They weren't just planning to use me. They were planning to ruin me. I closed the laptop, my whole body trembling, but my mind was eerily calm. The hurt was so deep it had gone past pain and turned into something else entirely, something cold and hard and sharp. I looked out the window at the endless, glittering city, a city I had conquered on my own terms. They thought they could take it from me. They thought I was their asset to be liquidated. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, steady and deliberate. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. And for that, they were going to. This was no longer about defending it was about taking back my life. Hardest thing I've ever had to do was pick up my phone the next morning. My fingers felt disconnected from my brain as I dialed my mother's number. I had rehearsed the words in my head 100 times, practicing the right tone of contrite daughter. When she answered, her voice was clipped and cold. She was still punishing me with her silence. I took a breath and launched into my performance. I told her I had been thinking, that I had been stressed with work and hadn't been fair. I told her that of course she was right, that family was the most important thing, and that I would be honored, truly honored, to host Olivia's engagement party. I laid it on thick, my voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. I could almost feel her preening on the other end of the line. She told me she was glad I'd finally seen sense. There was no apology, no warmth, just the satisfaction of a general accepting a surrender. Next, I called Olivia. This was harder. A part of my heart still ached for the sister I thought I had. I fed her the same lines, and her reaction was instant, gushing relief. She told me how happy this made her, how much it meant to her and Mark. She insisted we all go out for lunch to celebrate and start planning properly. Her, me, and Mark. It was the last thing I wanted, but I knew it was the perfect opportunity. I needed to see them, to look them in the eye and watch them lie. We met at a chic bistro in Soho, the kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who hover. The entire lunch felt like an out-of-body experience. I was a puppet, smiling, nodding, and saying all the right things. I asked about the guest list, feigning excitement. I listened to Mark talk about his work. My mind a cold, silent vault of information, cross-referencing every word he said with the emails I'd read. He was slick. I'll give him that. He talked about emerging markets and disruptive ventures, a whole lot of expensive words that meant absolutely nothing. He was selling an illusion, and my mother and sister had bought it wholesale. I played the role of the impressed, slightly ditzy older sister perfectly. I let my eyes glaze over when he talked finance, making myself seem like the creative type who couldn't possibly understand his complex world. This, I realized, was their image of me. Successful, but not rich, but not smart enough to protect it. It was the core of their entire plan, and I leaned into it with everything I had. The slip-up, when it came, was so small I almost missed it. Olivia was excitedly talking about their honeymoon plans, and I asked Mark how he could possibly take so much time off work with his big new project. He laughed, a self-satisfied, arrogant sound. He told me not to worry. He said the Apex initiative was practically running itself now. He bragged that he had just secured the final piece of funding that morning, and that once the announcement was made public after the engagement party, their investors would be thrilled. He mentioned that getting a legacy brand like Northgate Real Estate to sign on was the final seal of approval he needed. Apex Initiative, Northgate Real Estate. The names hung in the air between us. To Olivia, it was just more business jargon. To me, it was a lightning strike. Northgate Real Estate was not a legacy brand. I knew the name because they had been a client of mine 2 years ago, a small, family-run firm that was on the brink of bankruptcy. I had helped them redesign their offices in a last-ditch attempt to rebrand. They were good people, but they were small fish. There was no way they were the final seal of approval for a major initiative. Unless the initiative itself was a sham. Unless he was using their name, a name he probably got from my old client list, to give a fake company a veneer of legitimacy. I felt a jolt, a pure electric shock of insight. He wasn't just planning to take my money. He was building a house of cards and pieces of my life as the foundation. I just smiled, a wide, bright, empty smile. I told him that sounded incredibly impressive. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, a frantic, trapped bird. But my voice was easy. I excused myself to the restroom, and the second the door clicked shut behind me, the smile dropped from my face. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a woman with cold, furious eyes. He thought he was playing me. He had no idea I had my own game now, and he had just handed me the winning piece. The names Apex Initiative and Northgate Real Estate became my obsession. They were the only solid things I could cling to in a sea of lies. Back in the sterile quiet of my office, I stopped being a daughter or a sister. I became a researcher. My design work had trained me to be meticulous, to follow threads, to see how a single, flawed element could compromise an entire structure. I applied that same focus now to dismantling Mark's house of cards. My first calls weren't to family, but to my lawyers. Then, on their recommendation, to a man named Arthur Vance, a forensic accountant. Vance was a small, neat man who wore perfectly tailored suits and had eyes that seemed to see right through you. His office was the opposite of everything I designed. It was Spartan, functional, all steel and glass, with no warmth at all. It was the perfect place to dissect a crime. I sat across from him, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, and I laid out the little I knew. I gave him the names. I didn't tell him who they were to me. I framed it as a due diligence check on a potential investment I was considering. A lie to uncover a lie. He listened, not saying a word, just making small, precise notes on a legal pad. When I was done, he simply nodded and told me his firm was thorough and discreet. He said he would have a preliminary report for me in 72 hours. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of planning the engagement party with Olivia and my mother. I approved a caterer, discussed flower arrangements, and smiled through phone calls that felt like sandpaper on my soul. They were giddy, triumphant. They thought they had won. Their condescension was a constant, low hum beneath their cheerful words. My mother kept telling me she was so glad I was finally being part of the family, a phrase that now sounded like a threat. All the while, I was waiting for Vance's call, feeling like I was living a double life. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. His secretary asked if I could come to the office. An hour later, I was sitting across from him again, but this time, there was a thick, spiral-bound report on the table between us. The cover was blank. He pushed it towards me, and his expression was grim. He told me that my potential investment was not just unsound, it was a textbook case of securities fraud in the making. I opened the report. My hands were shaking. Vance had been thorough, all right. He had uncovered the shell company, the Apex Initiative, registered to an anonymous LLC in Delaware. He had tracked its meager funding back to a series of desperate loans taken out by Donahue Properties. He confirmed that Northgate Real Estate had no formal involvement. Their name was being used without their knowledge, likely lifted from public records of my past projects to add a sliver of credibility. But that wasn't the discovery that made my blood run cold. Vance, in his diligence, had done a deep dive on the Donahue family itself. And there, on page 12, was a section on George Donahue's early career. He had started his company in the same year as another, more successful developer, a man named Michael Sinclair, my father. The report included scanned clippings from old business journals. They were rivals, but not equals. My father's company had soared, built on a reputation for integrity and quality. George Donahue's had always struggled, plagued by bad deals and cut corners. They were from the same town, had known each other their whole lives. My father, in his quiet, brilliant way, had built an empire, while George had built a monument to his own mediocrity. My father had passed away 10 years ago, but reading those articles, I could feel the old resentment simmering off the page. It was a poison that had been festering for decades. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about Mark trying to save his family's failing business. This was a vendetta. It was George Donahue's pathetic, posthumous revenge on his old rival. And I was the prize, destroying my father's daughter, liquidating the assets he had left me, using his own legacy of success to bail out their failure. It was the ultimate twisted victory for a small, bitter man. And my mother had chosen their side. She had allied herself with the man who hated her husband's memory, all for a taste of the status she felt she deserved. I closed the report, the slick plastic covered my fingers. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down but it wasn't a tear of sadness, never about a house or a wedding. This was about so deep and so old, passed down from father to son. They were trying to erase they were trying to steal my name. And I realized this fight wasn't just for me anymore. It was for him. They had started a war with a ghost, and I was about to show them how fiercely his ghost could fight back. The report from Vance's firm was my shield and my sword, but a weapon is useless if you don't know how to wield it. I could go to the authorities, sure, but a white-collar crime investigation would take months, maybe years. It would be quiet, sanitized, hidden away in court filings. That wasn't the justice I wanted. Their crime was personal. A deep and intimate betrayal. The consequences needed to be just as personal. They wanted a public spectacle to launch their new life. I would give them one they never saw coming. My plan started with a name from my past, Robert Henderson, the owner of Northgate Real Estate. I remembered him as a kind, old-school gentleman, a man whose handshake was his bond. He had been proud of his small, family-run company, the one he had built from the ground up. He was exactly the kind of person Mark and his father would see as insignificant, a stepping stone to be used and discarded. He was their victim, just as much as I was. He was my perfect, unsuspecting ally. I got his number from my old project files and called him. I told him my name and reminded him of the redesign project we'd worked on. His voice warmed with recognition. I kept my tone professional, telling him I was vetting a new investment group that had listed Northgate as a partner, and I was hoping he could provide some confidential insight. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at his office. Walking into the Northgate real estate office was like stepping back in time. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish. Family photos dotted the walls. It was the complete opposite of the cold, ambitious world the Donahues were trying to build. Henderson greeted me warmly, offering me coffee in a thick ceramic mug. He was older now, his face a roadmap of a long, hard-working life. He reminded me so much of my father. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I opened my briefcase and laid the bound report from Vance on his desk. I simply said that I had reason to believe his company's name was being used in a fraudulent manner and that the details were inside. Then I sat back and watched his face as he read. I saw the polite confusion melt into a frown of concentration, then saw his eyes widen in disbelief. I watched his knuckles turn white as he gripped the pages. When he got to the part detailing the Apex initiative and how Northgate was being touted as a key investor, he let out a short, sharp breath, a sound of pure disgust. He closed the report and looked at me, his eyes blazing with an anger that mirrored my own. And then he told me something that made every hair on my arm stand on end. He said that Mark Donahue had approached him 6 months prior. He'd come to the office, oozing charm, and made a lowball offer to buy the Northgate brand outright. He'd spun a story about wanting to honor a legacy company while expanding his portfolio. Henderson, a man who valued his name more than money, had seen right through the superficial pitch and politely but firmly shown him the door. He'd thought it was just another arrogant young shark trying to swallow a smaller fish. He'd forgotten all about it. Until now. He stood up, walked over to a tall filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. Inside was the original written offer from Mark, printed on Donahue Properties letterhead. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was concrete, undeniable proof of Mark's premeditated intent to use the Northgate name one way or another. It was the nail for his coffin. He put the letter on the desk next to my report. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two strangers bound together by a common enemy. He knew my father, he told me. He said Michael Sinclair was one of the few honest men in the business, and that it was a disgrace what these vultures were doing to his daughter. His voice was low and steady, filled with a righteous fury that gave me strength. He looked from the papers to me, a plan already forming in his eyes. He told me this wasn't just my fight, and they had tried to tarnish his name, the legacy he had spent 50 years building. He said that the engagement party sounded like the perfect place to set the record straight. He wasn't just going to be my witness. He was going to be my partner. He would make some calls, gather other small business owners the Donahues had likely tried to strong-arm over the years. We wouldn't just expose them. We would surround them. Mark wanted to impress the city's elite. Instead, he would be facing a jury of the very people he had tried to crush. The week leading up to the engagement party was a masterclass in deception. On the surface, I was the picture of a dutiful, loving sister. I spent an afternoon with Olivia, feigning delight as we sampled tiny, elaborate canapes from the caterer my mother had insisted on. I nodded along as she debated the merits of peonies versus roses, all while the names from Vance's report scrolled through my mind like a ticker tape. Apex Initiative, Northgate, securities fraud. Olivia was giddy, lost in a fantasy, and I was the ghost at her feast, smiling and nodding as I planned the collapse of her world. My real work happened at night. My penthouse, my sanctuary, became my war room. The state-of-the-art smart home system I had designed for its seamless elegance was now being repurposed for something far more tactical. I spent hours calibrating the massive digital art screen that covered one entire wall of the living room. To my mother and Olivia, I was just making sure the visuals were perfect for the party. In reality, I was linking it to a secure hidden server, accessible only from a small remote I would keep in my pocket. My design skills were put to a new, chilling use. I took the cold, dense data from Vance's report and transformed it into a story. I created a presentation, a sleek, minimalist, and utterly devastating slideshow. Each slide was a chapter in their treachery. I started with screenshots of the Project Prestige note. Then came the emails, with key phrases like the Sinclair asset, highlighted in a calm, professional font. I created infographics showing the sharp decline of Donahue Properties, stark red lines plunging downwards. Then, a slide dedicated to Northgate Real Estate, showing their logo next to a bold, red, fraudulent use. The final killer slide was a high-resolution scan of Mark's signed offer letter to Robert Henderson. There was no commentary, no accusations in my own words. Just their own words, their own numbers, laid bare for the world to see. It was clean, undeniable, and it was the most brutal thing I had ever. While I built my digital weapon, Robert Henderson was marshaling his forces. He made quiet calls to a handful of other small business owners, men and women of integrity who had been burned or bullied by George Donahue over the years. He didn't tell them the full story. He simply invited them to an exclusive engagement party for the Donahue heir, hosted at a prestigious penthouse, telling them it was a networking opportunity they wouldn't want to miss. They were my sleeper agents, their presence in the room a quiet, potent threat that George and Mark wouldn't understand until it was too late. The final piece of my resolve clicked into place 2 nights before the party. I was hiding a tiny backup audio recorder behind a bookshelf in the living room when I noticed my mother had left one of her clutch purses on a side table. Annoyed, I picked it up to move it, and it fell open. Inside, nestled among her lipstick and tissues, was a delicate, glittering tennis bracelet. It was new, expensive, and not at all her style. There was a small, embossed tag on the velvet pouch. It read, "With thanks from your partners at Donahue Properties." My breath hitched. It was a bribe, a bauble. She had sold her daughter's future, her late husband's legacy, for a cheap piece of corporate flattery. Any lingering, microscopic speck of doubt I had, any thought that maybe she was just misguided or manipulated, evaporated in that instant. She was a willing, eager co-conspirator. I placed the purse back on the table, my hands steady, my heart a frozen, solid block of ice. The day of the party arrived. The florists came and went, leaving clouds of white roses that made the air thick with a cloying sweetness. The catering staff set up their stations, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos brewing beneath the surface. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own home, making final checks. The presentation was loaded, hidden behind a beautiful, looping video of flowing digital ink. The hidden microphones were active. My allies were on their way. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, smoothing the lines of the simple, elegant black dress. I looked calm, resolute. The perfect hostess. The doorbell rang, the first guest arriving, and a slow, cold smile touched my lips. The stage was set. The party was in full swing, a symphony of manufactured joy in my living room. The air was thick with the scent of lilies. Laughter and conversation swelled in broken waves around. I moved through it all with a smile that felt like a mask carved from ice. My body playing the part of the gracious hostess while my mind was 1,000 counting down the second. I watched my mother, Helen, gliding through the crowd, her hand possessively stroking the marble of my fireplace as she spoke to one of Mark's potential investors. She was selling the illusion of old money, of a family deeply rooted in success, and my home was her primary exhibit. I watched my sister, Olivia, the radiant bride-to-be, clinging to Mark's arm. She was oblivious, a perfect porcelain doll, her face glowing with a happiness that was built on a foundation of lies. She caught my eye once and mouthed, "Thank you," her expression full of genuine, misguided gratitude. The knife in my gut twisted, and I watched Mark and his father, George Donahue. They were working the room like sharks circling a seal colony. George was focused on the older, more established guests, my contacts, the ones with real money and real power. Mark was charming the younger crowd, his future peers, with that easy, predatory confidence. They were a well-oiled machine, and I was the fuel they were planning to burn. The first sign of a crack in their perfect facade came about an hour in. I was near the bar, pretending to direct it, when I saw George pull Mark aside into the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The jovial mask was gone. George's face was a thundercloud of fury. His gestures were sharp, angry jabs in Mark's direction. Mark, for his part, looked like a petulant child being scolded. He kept shaking his head, his jaw tight. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. I saw the dynamics in a flash of insight. The overbearing, demanding father and the son who was struggling under the weight of his expectations. Their alliance wasn't one of partnership. It was one of command and control. Greed held them together, but pressure would surely tear them apart. A small, cold bit of satisfaction settled in my chest. They were already rotting from the inside. My secret allies, Robert Henderson and the others, had arrived. They blended in seamlessly, older gentlemen in quiet suits, nursing glasses of whiskey and observing. I saw George Donahue's eyes pass over them once, a flicker of confusion on his face. He knew their faces, but couldn't place why they would be at this party. The sight of them, standing silently in the corners of the room, was like seeing ghosts at a banquet. My ghosts. Finally, I slipped away. The balcony was my only escape. The cool October air was a shock to my system, clearing my head. Below me, the city glittered, an endless, pulsing web of light and life. This view had been my reward, the symbol of everything I had built on my own. They thought they could take it. They thought it was theirs for the asking. I thought of my father, of his quiet integrity, of the legacy of honesty he had tried to build. My fight was for him as much as it was for me. I was not just his daughter, I was his soldier. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cold air filling my lungs. Inside, the band had taken a break, and the chatter had quieted. It was time. I turned from the skyline, my sanctuary, and walked back through the glass doors. The warmth and noise of the party enveloped me, but this time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like an arena. My mother caught my eye from across the room, where she stood beaming beside George Donahue. She gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the small podium and microphone the band used. It was a silent command. Perform for us. A final surge of adrenaline, cold and clean, shot through me. I smiled back at her, a real smile this time, though she couldn't possibly understand its meaning. She thought I was about to give a toast, to celebrate their victory. She had no idea I was walking toward the gallows she had built for me, but it was her neck, not mine, in the noose. The show was about to begin. I walked to the microphone, the plush carpet silencing my footsteps. 100 faces turned towards me, their expressions a mixture of polite expectation and mild curiosity. In the front row of my audience stood my family, my mother, beaming with pride, Olivia, her eyes sparkling with joy, Mark looking smug and victorious beside her, and George Donahue, the patriarch, looking every bit the captain of industry. They thought this was their coronation. I tapped the microphone, a soft thud that drew the last wandering eyes. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified just enough to fill the room. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate Olivia and Mark. It means the world to our family to have you." I smiled. A slow, deliberate movement of my lips. A home, I've learned recently, is a very precious thing. It's more than just walls, and it's a place of trust, of safe place for family. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I looked directly at my mother. And my family, especially my mother and my future brother-in-law, have taught me an invaluable lesson lately about the true value of things. They've been working tirelessly on a very special project, a new venture to secure their future. They've been calling it Project Prestige. And tonight, in the spirit of celebration, I thought it was only right to share their incredible vision with all of you. With my thumb, I pressed the small black button of the remote in my hand. Behind me, the wall-sized screen flickered. The swirling ambient colors vanished, replaced by the stark white background of a presentation slide. At the top, in bold black letters, was the title, Project Prestige. And beneath it, the screenshot of the shared note between my mother, Olivia, and Mark. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Olivia squint, trying to read the words from across the room. I watched my mother's smile falter, her eyes darting from the screen to me, a flicker of panic in their depths. Mark's hand, which was resting on Olivia's back, tensed. The slide changed. Now it was the email chain. The words, "The Sinclair Asset," were highlighted in a brutal blood-red box. A collective, audible gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the soft, automated click as the next slide appeared. A simple, devastating line graph showing the financial state of Donahue Properties. A precipitous drop over 5 years, ending in a flat line of near bankruptcy. George Donahue's face, which had been ruddy with champagne, turned a chalky white. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Click. The next slide. The logo for the Apex Initiative side by side with the logo for Northgate Real Estate. Stamped across it in giant, semi-transparent letters was the word fraud. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Robert Henderson, my ally, take a deliberate step forward from the back of the room, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Several other men, the other ghosts I'd invited, did the same, forming a silent, accusing circle. Click. The final slide, the smoking gun. A high-resolution scan of Mark's official offer to buy Northgate, his arrogant, looping signature clearly visible at the bottom. I watched the full impact of it land. I saw the horror dawn on my mother's face as she realized what I had done, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I saw George Donahue take a half step towards me, his hand raised as if to stop the onslaught, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage and disbelief. Most of all, I watched my sister. Her face was a canvas of utter devastation. She looked from the screen to Mark, her brow furrowed and then back to the screen. I saw the moment the truth settled in her eyes, the moment her a choked, wounded sound escaped her lips. Into the dead silence, I raised the microphone one last. My voice was no longer celebratory, so I'd like to propose who taught me that some things are priceless. They insisted that this home was the only place worthy enough for this celebration, and they were right. A home is precious. I smiled, feeling a surge of power I had never known. That's why, in honor of this engagement, I've decided to sell this penthouse. I'll be donating a generous portion of the proceeds to a charity that helps homeless families find a place to call their own. All in Helen and Olivia's name, of course. With the rest, I'm going to travel. I'm going to find a place where I'm valued for who I am, not what I own. Cheers to the happy couple. I placed the microphone back on the stand. The click it made echoed in the tomb-like silence. I turned and walked off the small stage. The crowd parted for me, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. I didn't look at any of them. I didn't look at my mother's collapsing face or my sister's tears. I walked step by steady step across my beautiful living room, through the chaos I had created, and straight to the front door. I walked out, closed the door behind me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. The click of my front door closing behind me was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I didn't look back. I walked to the elevator, my heels echoing in the marble hallway, and pressed the button for the lobby. As the door slid shut, sealing me in a small, quiet box, I finally let out the breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just felt quiet. A profound, hollowed-out, and blessedly peaceful quiet. I had a bag packed and waiting in the trunk of my car. I drove out of the city, the familiar skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of light against the dark. I checked into a simple, clean hotel off a highway in New Jersey, a place of beige walls and anonymous art. The contrast was stark. I had just left a multi-million-dollar penthouse, a home I had poured my soul into for this. And yet, as I sat on the edge of the stiff, unfamiliar bed, I felt more at home than I had in years. I turned my phone off, climbed under the crisp, impersonal sheets, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. The fallout reached me in managed doses over the next few days. I turned my phone on for an hour each morning, letting my lawyer filter the noise. He told me what Henderson had described. The party had After I left, a stunned silence had given way to a frantic, ugly chaos. George Donahue had apparently started screaming, not at me, but at Mark, a torrent of abuse about his incompetence. My mother had tried to salvage the situation, babbling about a misunderstanding, a cruel joke, but the damage was done. My contacts, the real players in the room, had simply turned and walked out, their expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Robert Henderson and his allies had stayed just long enough to ensure every key investor in the room understood exactly what the Apex Initiative was. By morning, the Donahue name was poison in the financial circles of New York. Their ruin was swift and total. My phone was a minefield of desperation. Dozens of missed calls, voicemails from my mother, starting with rage, then descending into tearful pleading, then back to rage. Texts from Olivia. Just endless strings of question marks at first, then long, rambling messages of confusion and betrayal, though it was never clear who she felt betrayed by. I listened to none of it. I read none of it. I had my lawyer send a simple, clear cease and desist letter, a legal boundary to reinforce the emotional one I had finally built. A month later, I stood in the penthouse for the last time. It was mostly empty now, my life packed into boxes labeled keep, donate, or trash. The real estate agent had told me an all-cash offer had come in, well over the asking price. The sale was going to be quick. As I stood in the cavernous living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the bare windows, I found a small, forgotten box. Inside was a framed photo of me and my dad at Coney Island. I must have been 7 or 8. I was on his shoulders, my face split in a joyful, gap-toothed grin, reaching for the sky. He was looking up at me, and his expression adult. And that's when the final piece clicked into place for me. The tears finally, not tears of anger or sadness, quiet. I thought it, but looking at that, I knew he never. My father's pride in nothing to do with my success. Proud of the little girl who wasn't afraid to reach for the sky. The whole elaborate, painful takedown at the party wasn't about them at all. It was the last desperate act of a woman trying to prove her own worth to people who would never see it. The real victory wasn't the moment the slides came on. It was the moment I walked out the door. The moment I chose myself. I wiped my tears, tucked the photo safely in my purse, and walked out, leaving the keys on the counter. I didn't know where I was going next. I had a ticket to somewhere warm, with an ocean. Maybe I'd start a small design consultant. Maybe I'd learn to surf. For the first time, the future wasn't a blueprint. It was an open ocean. And I was finally. My story had a painful, ugly middle, but I was determined to write a beautiful end. A new Aurora was waiting. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a long and sharing it makes the load a little lighter. Curious to know where this story reached you. Let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, so I can see how far my newfound freedom has traveled. I have so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of deep betrayals, unexpected strength, and the kind of justice you can't help but root for. If this journey resonated with you, and you want to make sure you're here for the next one, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the channel. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss the first chapter when a new story begins. Consider it our pact things through to the very together.